Under the wide and endless sky, a young woman stepped down from the train, her heart beating with fragile hope and trembling anticipation. Dust swirled around her boots. The golden light of late afternoon wrapped her in a soft embrace, and in her hand she clutched a single trunk, worn but precious, carrying the last threads of her old life. She carried, too, a folded letter in her pocket, inked with tender promises that had fueled her journey westward. To the watching crowd, she was just another passenger arriving in a small frontier town. But within her chest lived a dream, the kind of dream that whispers of love, safety, and belonging. That dream burned gently, like a candle against the winds of uncertainty, and she nurtured it as though it were her last treasure. Her name was Elizabeth, and she had left everything familiar behind. The weary streets of the city, the long hours bent over cloth in dim boarding houses, the hunger of loneliness that had haunted her since childhood. The train that carried her across plains and rivers had been more than iron and smoke. It had been the vessel of her faith, carrying her toward the possibility of being cherished. Each mile westward was a prayer answered in motion, a healing journey away from despair and toward the tender promise of a husband's arms. The station platform hummed with noise, reunions, laughter, the cries of children, but Elizabeth stood very still. Her eyes searched the crowd, seeking the face she had memorized from descriptions, the man whose words had filled her nights with warmth. And then she saw him. A tall figure, polished boots, a neat vest, the air of prosperity about him. Her breath caught, her lips curved into a shy, radiant smile. At last, the man from the letters. The man who had promised her love. The man who was meant to be her beginning. But in his eyes there was no joy, no recognition of fate fulfilled, only hesitation, only cold calculation. A shadow passed over her spirit as he looked her up and down, his silence sharp enough to cut through the fragile fabric of her hope. The moment that should have been her salvation turned into the slow cracking of a dream. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones. Disappointment, reproach, rejection cloaked in courtesy. Elizabeth felt the weight of shame rise hot in her cheeks. He spoke not of love, not of companionship, but of dowry, reputation, and what she lacked. He pressed coins into her hand, as though love could be measured in silver, as though her worth could be weighed against possessions she did not have. Tears pricked her eyes, but she held her chin steady. Around her, the joyful world continued. Families reunited, wagons rattling, children laughing, and she sat alone with a heart cracked open. The dream she had carried across hundreds of miles dissolved like mist beneath the sun. For a long while she could not move, her body numb, her soul a tangle of grief. The bench where she sank became her witness, the wooden slats pressing into her back as she held herself upright against the temptation to crumble. The air was bright, yet within her the light dimmed, leaving her in a quiet night of sorrow while the world still shone. Yet even in the hour of heartbreak, destiny has its gentle ways of healing. A voice, warm and steady, broke through her silence. A man, not polished nor pretentious, but clothed in the dust and strength of honest work, looked at her with concern. His eyes, hazel-touched by sunlight, held no judgment, no greed, only kindness. He asked if she was well, though her tears had already betrayed the answer. And in that simple question lay something profound, the first sign that her story was not ending here, but beginning anew. It was in such moments, when the heart is most fragile, that true love can slip in unnoticed, like a seed finding fertile soil after a storm. Elizabeth, though trembling, felt the faint stirring of peace, as if her pain was being gently soothed by an unseen hand. She would not yet call it love. How could she? But it was compassion, and compassion is often the doorway through which love enters. The evening sun lingered, painting the town in hues of amber and rose. Elizabeth lifted her gaze, and though her eyes were swollen with sorrow, she found herself breathing easier under the warmth of that stranger's presence. A wounded heart, once rejected, was now being quietly tended by fate itself. Healing does not always arrive with grandeur. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a man who simply refuses to walk away when another has turned his back. And so, on that dusty frontier platform, Elizabeth's journey of despair began to soften into something else, something the heart can scarcely name but deeply recognizes, a promise greater than any letter could hold, a home deeper than any house could provide. In that fragile twilight, while smoke from distant chimneys curled toward the heavens, the seed of a story was planted, a tale not of wealth or reputation, but of love born from ashes, of light drawn out of darkness, of two souls destined to mend each other. If this story touches your heart, if it brings even a breath of comfort or a spark of hope, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Let your voice rest here among us, like kind words shared by the fire. If you wish to walk further with stories like this, filled with warmth and the quiet healing of love, then leave a gentle mark. Like, subscribe, and keep this journey alive. Your presence, your support, is the wind that keeps these tender flames burning. And perhaps, in listening, in sharing, you will find your own heart lifted, healed, and reminded that even from brokenness, love can always rise again. Elizabeth's smile, still fragile from hope, faltered under the weight of Henry's gaze. She had imagined this moment countless times during long, lonely nights on the train, clutching his letters to her heart. She had imagined laughter, joy, perhaps even a trembling embrace. Instead, she felt the sting of silence sharpen into words that bruised her spirit. He spoke of expectations unmet, of a dowry that did not exist, of furnishings she could not bring, as if love itself were nothing more than coin and property. His voice, cold and precise, cut her deeper than any blade could, and in that instant the dream she had carried westward began to unravel thread by thread. Her trunk, scuffed and plain, sat like a witness to her shame. Her dress, carefully pressed despite its simplicity, now felt like a mark of poverty rather than dignity. Elizabeth tried to steady her voice, whispering that she had come prepared to work, to love, to build a home, but Henry's jaw remained stiff. He pressed a small purse of coins into her hand, his gesture not of love, but of dismissal, as if she were a beggar to be paid off. And then, with a final tip of his polished hat, he turned his back and vanished into the streets of town, leaving her adrift among strangers. For a long time, Elizabeth sat motionless on the wooden bench, her heart thundering against the hollow of her chest. The noise of the station carried on, laughter, calls, the hiss of steam, yet all of it blurred around her. She was alone, utterly, achingly alone. She had crossed miles of earth for a promise that dissolved in a single breath. What remained was only the echo of rejection and the sharp ache of being unwanted. The purse of coins in her palm burned with humiliation. She wanted to fling it into the dust, yet her trembling fingers clutched it still, for what else did she have? The thought of returning east tightened her throat with despair. There was no home to return to, no arms to welcome her. Only the emptiness of an orphan's past and the endless grind of survival. The sun pressed heavy and unkind upon her bonnet, heat wrapping around her as if to smother her sorrow. She whispered a silent prayer, though her words quivered, her faith dimmed. She begged not for riches, nor even for joy, but for a place to belong, for some fragment of healing that could mend the raw wound Henry had carved open. And then, from the haze of her grief, a voice reached her, gentle, steady, carrying neither judgment nor pity, but an earnest concern. Elizabeth lifted her tear-stung eyes to see a man standing nearby. He was not polished like Henry. Dust clung to his boots, and his shirt was marked with honest labor. A sack of feed rested against his shoulder, and when he set it down, his movements were careful, as though he wished not to startle her. His jaw was strong, lightly shadowed, his skin bronzed by sun, and in his hazel eyes shimmered something rare, kindness that asked for nothing in return. Elizabeth tried to form words, to say she was fine, though her trembling voice betrayed the lie. The stranger did not retreat from her weakness. Instead, he sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving respectful space between them, his hat held loosely in weathered hands. He spoke softly, telling her no one deserved to be treated as she had been, and in the warmth of his tone, the wall she had built against sorrow cracked. A sob escaped, unbidden, and she pressed her hand against her mouth in shame. Yet he did not flinch, did not look away. He simply waited, steady as the earth, allowing her the dignity of her grief. "My name's Jacob," he said gently, his words carrying the ease of truth. "Jacob Hale. I run a ranch a few miles out of town." Elizabeth, still trembling, whispered her name in return, and in speaking it aloud felt the faintest anchor steady her drifting heart. His gaze held no ridicule, only a deep compassion, as if he understood the sharp ache of loneliness himself. She told him, haltingly, of the promise that had been broken, of the rejection that still stung like fresh fire. And as she spoke, the burden of silence lifted just enough for her lungs to breathe again. Jacob listened, not interrupting, not judging, his eyes soft with the weight of empathy. When she confessed she had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, his expression shifted with quiet resolve. He offered her a place of safety, a boarding house in town, or, if she preferred, a spare room at his ranch. His voice carried no hidden intent, no trace of pressure, only sincerity, the kind that seeps into wounded places and begins to heal. Elizabeth hesitated. The rules of propriety echoed in her mind. What would people say of a woman accepting shelter from a stranger? Yet the alternative was bleak. An expensive boarding house filled with rowdy men, or worse, the cold streets of a town that was not hers. And something in Jacob's eyes, a light shaded by sorrow of his own, told her she was safe. He had known loneliness too, and perhaps because of it, he recognized her need. Her voice quivered as she whispered that she did not want to impose. But Jacob only shook his head, a gentle smile easing the heaviness of the moment. "It's no imposition," he said softly. "The ranch is quiet. I could use the company. There was no pride in his tone, no sense of obligation, only the simple generosity of a heart that had endured grief and chosen kindness still. At last Elizabeth nodded, a fragile bloom of gratitude unfurling in her chest. She allowed Jacob to lift her trunk, the same trunk Henry had scorned, and carry it as though it were weightless. Together they walked toward his wagon. The town's curious eyes followed, some smiling knowingly, others whispering, but Elizabeth held her head high. Shame had no place when kindness was offered with such sincerity. The wagon creaked as Jacob helped her onto the seat. The horse shifted, the sun dipped low, and the horizon stretched wide, painted with shades of orange and rose. Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap, glancing at Jacob's profile as he guided the reins with quiet confidence. There was a steadiness about him that soothed the tremor of her spirit, and when he spoke, his words carried the power of healing. That the man who had cast her aside was a fool, that her worth was not measured by gold nor gowns. His voice was firm, almost fierce on her behalf, and Elizabeth felt those words sink deep into the hollow carved by rejection. Tears shimmered again, but this time they were touched with something gentler than grief, perhaps relief, perhaps hope. She turned her face toward the fading light of the prairie, and for the first time since stepping onto that platform, she breathed without pain. The dream she had carried westward was not lost. It was simply changing shape, like a flame reborn from embers. And though she did not yet know the name of this new dream, she could feel it stirring in her heart, warm, tender, and healing, as the wagon rolled toward the promise of an unknown tomorrow. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, a vast sea of gold and green, its quiet immensity both humbling and soothing. Elizabeth sat beside Jacob in the wagon, her trunk safely stowed in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding on to the fragments of her courage. The air was scented with earth and wild grass, a fragrance new to her yet strangely comforting. The horse's hooves struck the dirt road in a steady rhythm, a heartbeat of the land itself, carrying her further from rejection and closer to something she could not yet name. Jacob guided the reins with sure hands, his eyes focused on the horizon, though his presence radiated warmth that reached her even in silence. Every so often Elizabeth dared to glance at him. His profile in the soft evening light carried strength etched by hardship and softened by kindness. The sun lit his hair with threads of gold, and though his jaw was firm, there was a gentleness in the lines of his face. She wondered what griefs he had carried, what losses had carved that quiet sorrow lingering in his eyes. Yet whatever storms he had weathered, he had not grown bitter. Instead, he had offered her shelter without hesitation, as though her pain was his own to share. That thought alone brought a healing calm to her chest. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two souls who did not yet know each other, but who sensed that words would come in time. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying an undercurrent of conviction. He told her plainly that Henry was blind, that no man of worth would dismiss her because she lacked riches. He called Henry's heart small, and in those words Elizabeth felt something inside her loosen, as though a chain had fallen away. She had believed herself unworthy. But here was a man who saw her differently. His defense of her dignity was more precious than any promise Henry's polished letters had ever contained. Her throat tightened, her eyes filling with tears she tried to blink away. Yet, when she whispered her thanks, Jacob only nodded, his expression serious but kind, as if such words needed no reply. The wagon crested a gentle rise, and before them appeared a stretch of fenced land, cattle grazing like scattered shadows, and in the distance a plume of smoke rising softly from a chimney. "That's my place," Jacob said quietly. His voice carried no pride, only the steady contentment of a man rooted in his land. Elizabeth followed his gaze, and something stirred in her chest. The ranch stood simple yet strong against the horizon, touched by the glow of sunset. It seemed to her less a possession and more a living thing, a home that had grown from soil and sweat, from memories and hope. By the time the wagon rattled into the yard, dusk had gathered, laying a soft violet veil across the world. Elizabeth's weary body ached, yet the sight of the ranch brought a fragile spark of peace. A middle-aged man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Jacob introduced him as Roy, a trusted hand, and though his eyes flickered with curiosity, his greeting was warm. Elizabeth felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. She was not an intruder, not here. Jacob carried her trunk inside, leading her through the modest house that smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. The hearth bore ashes of an old fire, the shelves were lined with practical books, and on the mantel rested small keepsakes that spoke of a life lived with love and loss. A shawl lay across a rocking chair, a vase of dried wildflowers held its quiet beauty, and Elizabeth wondered at the story of the woman who once filled these spaces with laughter. The room Jacob showed her was small but clean, with a bed neatly made, a washstand with a cracked but polished mirror, and a simple oil lamp casting its glow. He explained that it had once been his sister's room when she visited, but now it would be hers for as long as she needed. Elizabeth's eyes brimmed with gratitude. She placed her bonnet on the bed, her fingers trembling with the weight of the day. For the first time since stepping onto the platform, she felt a measure of safety. Jacob, with his quiet grace, left her to rest, reminding her she need not rush into anything. His words carried a kindness that reached deeper than courtesy. It was the language of healing, allowing her to breathe again without fear of judgment. When the door closed behind him, Elizabeth sat on the bed, her hands clasped together, whispering a prayer of thanks. The rejection she had endured still cut sharply, but alongside it bloomed gratitude, fragile and luminous, for the stranger whose kindness had saved her from despair. That night, wrapped beneath her mother's quilt, she slept more deeply than she had in months. Dreams came, not of loss, but of gentle horizons, of the sound of Jacob's steady voice telling her she was enough. The house creaked softly around her, not with loneliness, but with the memory of lives once lived, as if welcoming her into its embrace. When dawn came with the crow of a rooster and the scent of earth rising fresh from dew, Elizabeth awoke with a sense of renewal she had not thought possible. The ache of rejection lingered, yet within it was a softer note, the beginning of healing. Determined to repay the kindness she had received, she rose and dressed quickly. Her hands, long accustomed to work, found purpose in the kitchen. She kneaded biscuit dough, fried bacon, brewed coffee, and cracked eggs into a hot pan, filling the air with the fragrance of a homecoming she had never known. When Jacob stepped through the door, surprise lit his face at the sight of her cooking. Elizabeth, cheeks flushed, offered a shy smile, her voice quiet but steady, as she explained it was the least she could do. Jacob removed his hat, his expression softening into appreciation. Roy soon joined them, and together they shared the meal at the small wooden table. As they bowed their heads for grace, Elizabeth felt a warmth unfurl within her, like sunlight reaching into long neglected corners. The clatter of forks, the laughter at Roy's teasing, the gentle rhythm of conversation, all of it wrapped her in a sense of belonging she had never thought to claim. She realized with a swelling heart that this simple table, this modest ranch, already felt more like home than any place she had ever known. When Jacob spoke of his past, his words hushed with the memory of Catherine, the wife he had loved and lost. Elizabeth listened with quiet reverence. She reached out instinctively, her hand resting gently on his arm, her touch carrying not pity, but shared understanding. For she, too, knew the ache of absence, the void left by those who had once been everything. In that moment, grief became not a wall, but a bridge, binding them in silent kinship. From then on, the days unfolded like threads weaving into a new tapestry. Elizabeth tended the garden, gathered eggs from the hens, and mended shirts with careful stitches. She carried water, baked bread, and stood at Jacob's side as he repaired fences beneath the relentless sun. Every small task carried with it a sense of purpose, a quiet healing, as though her soul was stitching itself back together with each motion. And every evening, as the sky burned with twilight, she and Jacob sat on the porch, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes silence so comfortable it felt like music. The bond between them grew not with sudden declarations, but with the steady rhythm of shared days, with glances that lingered a moment too long, with hands brushing over tools and lingering just enough to stir unspoken hope. Elizabeth found her heart softening, opening, daring to dream again. She had thought her story ended with Henry's rejection, but now she understood. That was only the breaking, the place where the light could enter. Her journey was not to be abandoned, it was to be rewritten, here, in the tender company of a man whose kindness was stronger than fire, whose presence was as healing as the sunrise. And so, without realizing it, Elizabeth began to belong, to the land, to the rhythm of the ranch, and perhaps, in time, to Jacob's heart. What had begun as a refuge was quietly becoming a home, and what had been the ashes of despair now smouldered with the first bright sparks of love. The world had turned her away, but here, in the quiet of Sagebrush Hills, she felt the truth. Love has a way of finding those who still believe, even in their darkest hour. And in that gentle dawn of her new life, Elizabeth's heart, once broken, began to beat in harmony with another's, carrying her into the promise of a story yet to unfold. The days slipped into weeks, each one weaving Elizabeth more tightly into the fabric of ranch life, until her presence felt as natural as the wind on the open plain. At first, she had thought her stay would be brief, a single night, perhaps two, just long enough to gather strength before deciding where to go. But morning after morning, she rose with the crow of the rooster, braided her hair neatly, and found herself stepping into the rhythm of the household, as though it had always been hers. What began as gratitude for shelter slowly blossomed into belonging, and each small task she performed stitched a healing thread through the torn places of her heart. She tended the chickens, scattering grain with laughter as they clucked at her feet. She gathered eggs, polished by straw and sunlight, carrying them in her apron like fragile jewels. She watered the vegetables and pulled weeds, her hands sinking into the warm soil that seemed to welcome her touch. She cooked meals with a quiet pride, seasoning them not just with herbs, but with care. And when Jacob or Roy complimented her cooking, she felt the glow of worth rise within her chest. The orphaned child she once was, the rejected bride she had been, faded into the background. In their place stood a woman discovering her strength and her tenderness all at once. Jacob watched her often, though never in a way that made her uneasy. His gaze carried no demand, only admiration, as though he could not quite believe that this woman, gentle yet resilient, had arrived at his doorstep by chance. He found himself smiling at the way she hummed softly while hanging laundry, the way her brow furrowed with determination when learning to knead bread, the way her laughter sounded like bells when Roy teased her. In her presence, his house no longer echoed with emptiness. The silence that had once haunted him since Catherine's passing was now filled with warmth, the quiet music of companionship that soothed even the deepest scars of grief. And Elizabeth, though careful with her heart, began to notice Jacob too. The strength in his shoulders as he carried heavy loads with ease. The kindness in his voice when he spoke to his horse as if it were an old friend. The steadiness in his eyes when he listened to her stories, never dismissing, never distracted. Each glance, each smile, each moment shared added another stone to the foundation being laid between them. It was not a love born of haste or desperation, but of trust, of gentle healing, of two wounded souls slowly leaning toward one another. One evening, Jacob led her beyond the house to a small hill crowned by a solitary oak. Beneath its branches lay a simple marker carved with Catherine's name. Wild prairie roses bloomed at its base, tender blossoms defying the harsh winds of the plains. Jacob stood there with his hat in his hands, his voice soft as he spoke of the woman he had lost, the way she filled the house with music, the sharp wit hidden behind her gentle smile, the illness that had stolen her too soon. Elizabeth listened, her eyes shimmering, her heart aching with empathy. When his voice faltered, she laid her hand upon his arm, offering no words, only presence. And Jacob, feeling the sincerity of her touch, found himself able to breathe again. He had carried his grief in silence for so long, but now, speaking Catherine's name aloud with Elizabeth beside him, it felt less like a wound and more like a scar. Painful, yes, but healing with time. That night, as they sat together on the porch, shelling peas beneath a violet sky, Jacob asked about Elizabeth's past. She spoke hesitantly at first, of the orphanage where she grew up, of the long hours at the seamstress's table, of the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow. She spoke of answering Henry's advertisement, of believing in his words, and of the cruel rejection that had nearly broken her spirit. Jacob's eyes never wavered from hers. When she finished, he told her softly that she was braver than she realized, that leaving everything familiar behind in search of hope was not weakness but strength. His words wrapped around her like a balm, easing the ache of shame she had carried. For the first time, she began to believe that her courage, though born of desperation, was a gift. As summer deepened, their companionship grew into something unspoken but undeniable. They shared quiet moments that lingered in memory, her laughter drifting through the fields as she tried to milk a stubborn cow for the first time, his gentle hand guiding hers when teaching her to ride. Sometimes their fingers brushed by accident, and a spark passed between them, leaving both a little breathless. though neither dared name it. In the evenings they spoke of dreams, Elizabeth of her longing for family and a true home, Jacob of his hope to see the ranch thrive once more. Slowly those dreams began to entwine, weaving a future that shimmered just beyond the horizon. Then came the day when the prairie itself rose against them. The air turned strange, tinged with an orange haze, and a faint scent of smoke drifted on the wind. Elizabeth, sitting on the porch with her mending, looked up to see a smear of dark smoke staining the sky. Her heart clenched with fear just as Jacob came galloping from the pasture, urgency in every line of his body. There was no time for questions. The prairie was burning. A wildfire, hungry and fast, bore down upon them, and the land that had nurtured their fragile healing was suddenly threatened with ruin. Together, they fought with desperate determination. Elizabeth hauled buckets of water, her arms trembling but unyielding, soaking the walls and roof to guard against falling embers. Jacob carved trenches into the earth, sweat and soot streaking his face as he tried to hold back the fire's advance. Roy and a neighboring hand rushed to drive the livestock toward safer ground. The sky darkened with smoke. The roar of the flames thundered like a freight train, and still Elizabeth and Jacob worked side by side, refusing to yield. When the fire leapt, the fence and embers rained like fiery snow. Chaos erupted. Elizabeth dashed into the house to save what little she could. Her trunk, her mother's quilt, the treasured portrait of Jacob's family, and the sketch of Catherine. But a window shattered. Flames licked the porch, and she fell hard against a chair, her ankle twisting in agony. Smoke filled her lungs, blinding her eyes, and terror surged. Until Jacob burst through the door, his voice steady even as the world burned. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her through the heat and smoke, shielding her with his body as the roof began to collapse. Outside, with fire closing in, Jacob set her in the wagon, her trunk beside her, and snapped the reins. The horse bolted, the wagon jolted, and together they fled into the night, the inferno consuming the home they had built together. Embers whirled around them, sparks catching in Elizabeth's hair, until Jacob smoothed them away with a swift, protective hand. He drove with fierce concentration, his arm wrapped firmly around her, steadying her even as pain pulsed through her injured ankle. At last they reached a creek, a charred, safe ground where nothing was left to burn. The fire roared behind them, but they were safe, for the moment. Jacob's sleeve was scorched, his arm badly burned, his cheek cut from flying debris. Elizabeth, trembling, tore fabric from her petticoat, soaked it with water, and bound his wounds with trembling hands. Tears streaked her soot-stained cheeks as she whispered that he had come back for her, that he had risked everything, not for the ranch, but for her. Jacob's reply, roughened by smoke, was simple yet eternal. He would do it again, 1,000 times. In that moment, with the world around them burning, Elizabeth knew the truth her heart had been whispering for weeks. She loved him. She loved his strength, his gentleness, his devotion, and the way he had looked at her, not with judgment, but with reverence. Her tears, though born of fear, now carried the sweetness of love realized. And as Jacob drew her close, his hand steady upon hers, she felt a vow unspoken pass between them. Whatever they faced, they would face together. Night fell, and they camped by the creek with the cattle and a few salvaged supplies. The fire raged in the distance, but within the circle of Jacob's arm, Elizabeth felt safe, held by more than flesh and bone, by trust, by love, by the healing power of two broken souls choosing to stand as one. The prairie might burn, houses might fall, but what had been forged between them would endure. The ashes of despair had given birth to something fierce and tender all at once. And when morning came, with rain falling gently from the heavens to quench the dying embers, Elizabeth lifted her face to the sky, tears mingling with the droplets, and whispered her gratitude. For though the land was scarred, her heart was whole, and beside her stood the man who had turned her rejection into redemption. Their story was only beginning, written not in ink or letters, but in fire, in healing, and in love that would outlast the storm. The rain that had saved them fell through the night in a steady, soothing rhythm, quenching the last flames and leaving the land veiled in smoke and silence. When dawn broke, the prairie looked like another world, stripped bare, blackened and scarred. Elizabeth leaned on Jacob as they crossed back over the creek, her ankle bound in the splint he had fashioned, and her heart tightened at the sight. The house was wounded, but still standing in part. The barn was a heap of smouldering ruin. Fences lay charred, pastures singed, the air heavy with ash. Yet even in ruin, Elizabeth felt something stirring, an ember of determination that matched the steel in Jacob's eyes. Loss had struck hard, but it had not broken them. Together they began the slow, healing work of sifting through what remained. Jacob's neighbors came as soon as the news spread, arriving with wagons, tools, lumber, and food. In the frontier, when one family suffered, the community rose to help. Elizabeth watched in awe as men rebuilt fences beam by beam, women tended meals for the workers, and children carried buckets of water to douse stubborn embers. Jacob thanked each of them with quiet gratitude, his voice steady even as his eyes betrayed the ache of watching his home reduced to ashes. Elizabeth, though limping, refused to be idle. She scrubbed soot from what furniture could be saved, cooked meals, and stitched new curtains from fabric offered by a neighbor. Each task, though small, carried the weight of love, as though she were sewing her heart into the house itself. Jacob never let her lift more than she should, scolding gently when she pushed herself too hard. Yet Elizabeth insisted, whispering that she needed to give as much as she received. She found purpose in the rebuilding, her healing ankle a mirror to the healing of the ranch. Each day the place grew stronger, sturdier, rising from the ashes like a promise fulfilled. And with every moment Jacob looked at her, his gaze lingered longer, his voice softened more. One evening, after the neighbors had gone, they sat together on the porch step, the air cool and scented faintly of rain and charred earth. Elizabeth, her ankle propped up, looked at the skeletal outline of the barn and felt sorrow. But Jacob reached for her hand. His rough fingers brushed hers gently, a tenderness that sent warmth coursing through her veins. He whispered that the ranch could be rebuilt, but what he could not have rebuilt, had it been lost, was her. His eyes held hers, fierce and vulnerable all at once, and Elizabeth felt her breath catch. She confessed then through tears that the thought of losing him in the fire had been more unbearable than the thought of losing the house. The words spilled from her heart, raw and unguarded. Jacob's reply came not with hesitation, but with certainty. He was hers, and he was not going anywhere. He reached into his pocket and drew out a ring, worn yet gleaming faintly in the twilight. It had belonged to his grandmother, then to Catherine, and now, with trembling hands, he offered it to Elizabeth. His voice, low and unshaken, carried the weight of both grief and healing as he told her Catherine had once urged him not to let sorrow keep his heart locked forever. He said he had found the woman who brought light back into his home, who healed wounds he thought would never close. He asked her to be his wife, to stay not as a guest, but as the keeper of his heart. Elizabeth's answer burst forth in a flood of tears and joy. She said yes, her voice trembling yet radiant. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and though it sat a touch loose, it shone with a light brighter than any gold. She threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her with a laugh choked by emotion. Their kiss, sweet and lingering, was not only a vow, but a balm, sealing the broken places of both their souls. Love, forged in fire, had risen from the ashes. News of their engagement spread swiftly, carried on eager voices across the plains. Neighbors returned not only to help rebuild, but to celebrate. They spoke of how tragedy had been transformed into blessing, how from the embers of despair a new home and family were being born. Elizabeth, once a stranger with no place to call her own, now found herself embraced by a community who welcomed her as one of their own. She belonged. The orphaned girl who had journeyed west with nothing but a trunk and a dream had found a home, a husband, and a life woven from love. The day of the wedding came with autumn's crisp air, the sky clear as crystal. Beneath the oak tree that shaded Catherine's resting place, friends and neighbors gathered. They built an arch of willow branches, draped it with ribbons, and scattered wildflowers around its roots. Elizabeth wore a borrowed gown of cream linen, altered with loving care to fit her. In her hair, sprigs of baby's breath glimmered softly in the light. Jacob, in his best suit, stood tall and steady, his eyes shining as he waited for her. When Elizabeth stepped out from the house, her limp still faint but her spirit radiant, Jacob felt his breath falter. She was luminous, her dark hair catching the light, her smile glowing through tears. She walked down the makeshift aisle, her gaze locked with his, and the world around them disappeared. Halfway, Jacob could not wait. He strode forward to meet her, and together they walked arm in arm beneath the oak. The preacher's words were simple but strong, speaking of love, second chances, and vows made in fire and water. When Jacob declared his promise to cherish Elizabeth, his thumb brushed her hand tenderly, sealing the words with touch. When Elizabeth vowed to love him for all her days, her voice rang clear as a bell, filled with the certainty of a soul healed by love. They exchanged rings, Jacob placing his father's gold band on his own hand, Elizabeth's heirloom ring gleaming anew on hers. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Jacob cupped Elizabeth's face as he kissed her, gentle yet full of devotion. The crowd erupted with cheers, laughter, and joyful tears. Even the oak seemed to murmur blessing as the wind rustled its leaves. The reception was simple but rich in spirit. Neighbors laid out tables of bread, roasted chicken, pies, and cider. A fiddler played lively tunes, and soon Jacob was twirling Elizabeth in the dust, her laughter ringing as bright as the stars above. Toasts were raised, blessings spoken, and for the first time Elizabeth felt what it meant to be truly home. When the night quieted and the last guests departed, Jacob led her to the porch, where two rocking chairs waited side by side. They sat together, still in their wedding clothes, gazing at the starlit sky. Elizabeth rested her head on his shoulder, her hand in his, and whispered that she never imagined such peace could be hers. Jacob kissed her hair and told her life had given him sorrow so he could know the full measure of blessing when joy arrived. In that moment, they both understood. Their love was not fragile, but forged in trial, tested by fire, strengthened by healing. The prairie stretched vast before them, scarred yet alive, and under the endless sky they knew their story had only just begun. Whatever storms might come, they would face them side by side. And in the warmth of each other's embrace, Elizabeth felt the final truth settle deep within her soul. She was home forever, and love would be her shelter all her days. The seasons turned gently after their vows beneath the oak, and with each passing day, Elizabeth and Jacob wove their lives together more tightly, as if the very fabric of the ranch was stitched with their love. Autumn gave way to winter, the air sharp and crystalline, mornings frosted with white breath upon the glass. The prairie, stripped of its green abundance, lay hushed beneath the pale sky, yet inside the house warmth glowed steady from the hearth. The house that had once been scarred by fire now echoed with laughter and quiet contentment, with the murmur of voices and the creak of rocking chairs side by side. Elizabeth, who had arrived with nothing but a trunk and fragile hope, now moved through the rooms as mistress of the home. Curtains she had sewn fluttered softly in the kitchen, and her touch was evident in every detail, from jars of preserves lined neatly on the shelves to quilts stitched with love upon the beds. She filled the house with gentle order, and Jacob found himself marveling at how quickly she had breathed life back into the place. Where once silence had been heavy, now there was the sweet hum of belonging. Evenings became their cherished sanctuary. After the day's labour, Jacob in the fields, Elizabeth at the hearth, they would settle together on the porch or before the fire, hands clasped, voices sharing the small details of life. Sometimes they spoke of dreams for the ranch's future, new barns rising, calves fattening, orchards planted. Other times they spoke of heart's dreams, quieter but deeper, the longing for children, the hope of filling their home with the laughter of little ones. Jacob's voice would grow tender as he spoke of hearing footsteps run across the porch again, of rocking a child beneath the same oak where vows had been made. Elizabeth would smile, her heart swelling, her fingers tracing the ring he had placed on her hand, whispering that she, too, longed for such blessings. These conversations, warm and fragile, were like seeds scattered in rich soil, waiting to bloom in their season. Winter storms tested their endurance, snow sweeping over the plains and piling against the walls. But even in the bitter cold, their bond deepened. Jacob chopped wood in the biting wind, his breath steaming as he hauled logs to the hearth. Elizabeth brewed broth, kneaded bread, and tended to the animals with steadfast care despite the chill. At night, wrapped in blankets, they leaned into each other's warmth, finding healing in the nearness of a love that carried them through the darkness. The storms outside raged, but within their hearts was calm, as if their souls had become each other's shelter. Spring arrived with a burst of life, the charred land from the fire now pushing forth tender green shoots. New fences stood tall, cattle grazed upon fresh grass, and the air carried the fragrance of wild flowers blooming defiantly against the memory of ash. Elizabeth's laughter mingled with bird-song as she worked in the garden, planting herbs and flowers, her skirts brushing the soil that welcomed her as its own. Jacob often paused in his labor, leaning on a fence post, watching her move with grace, his chest swelling with gratitude. He thought often of Catherine, and how she had once feared he would remain bound to grief forever. Now he knew she would have smiled to see him whole again, to see him love and be loved with such fullness. Neighbors continued to visit, their bonds forged even stronger by the fire that had once tested them all. There were gatherings in the evenings where music and laughter carried across the prairie. Elizabeth, once an outsider, now felt the warmth of belonging, embraced by the community as Jacob's wife and as a woman of strength in her own right. She was no longer the girl abandoned on a train platform. She was a woman rooted in love, her story rewritten with healing and grace. One golden afternoon, Jacob surprised her with a ride across the fields. He lifted her gently onto his horse, steadying her with a hand at her waist, his touch lingering. They rode together, the horizon wide, the wind carrying away the last remnants of their sorrows. When they reached a rise overlooking the ranch, Jacob drew her close and whispered that everything he had, land, cattle, dreams, was hers as much as his. Elizabeth, her heart brimming, pressed her cheek against his shoulder and whispered back that the only treasure she had ever truly longed for was his love, and that now she had it, she was the richest woman alive. Their kiss beneath the wide sky was not hurried, nor born of desperation, but slow and deep, like the earth itself opening to spring. In that moment, Elizabeth knew her journey was not only about finding a husband or a home. It was about finding healing, about discovering that love could grow even in the soil of sorrow. Jacob's arms around her, the sound of the prairie alive with renewal, the sun spilling gold across the fields. This was not the end of their story, but the flourishing of it. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of rose and amber, they turned back toward the ranch, their hands entwined upon the reins. The house awaited, warm with firelight. The oak tree whispered above Catherine's grave, and the prairie stretched wide, carrying their laughter into the horizon. Elizabeth knew trials would come again, for life was never without storms. Yet she also knew that whatever came, love would carry them, steady as the land, gentle as the rain, eternal as the stars. And in that certainty her heart rested, healed and whole, ready for every dawn yet to rise. Summer returned with its warmth, stretching across the prairie in endless waves of gold, and with it came the full rhythm of life at Sagebrush Hills. Elizabeth had by now become part of the land itself, her footsteps in the garden paths, her laughter rising from the porch, her hands weaving healing into every corner of the home. The scars of the fire no longer defined the ranch. Instead, it bore the mark of renewal, a place rebuilt not just with timber and nails, but with love that had endured flames and survived. The barn stood tall again, fences gleamed under the sun, and even the once charred earth had blossomed with tender shoots of green. Jacob worked with steady determination, his shirt clinging with sweat as he drove posts and mended tools, but the weight of labor no longer felt like solitude. When he glanced toward the house and saw Elizabeth at the window or tending to the flower beds, a deep peace filled his chest. Where once silence had haunted him, now love steadied him. And Elizabeth, seeing him through the frame of the kitchen door or striding across the pasture, felt her heart swell each time, as though love itself was a healing tide flowing endlessly between them. Evenings became the softest hours of their days. After supper, they sat together on the porch, the horizon blushing with twilight, her hand resting in his as the stars unfolded one by one. They spoke of small things, the calf born that morning, the way the roses had begun to climb the trellis, or sometimes they spoke of their deepest dreams. Elizabeth longed to see the house filled with children's laughter, to raise sons and daughters who would grow strong beneath the vast western sky. Jacob listened with eyes alight, confessing that he too dreamed of hearing little feet race across the porch, of teaching his children to ride, of showing them the land he had poured his soul into. These conversations, whispered beneath the stars, stitched the promise of a future they had both once thought impossible. On Sundays, neighbors gathered, bringing food and music, and the ranch that had once been scarred became a place of joy. Children played in the fields, women exchanged recipes, men spoke of cattle prices and rainfall. Elizabeth, moving among them with her gentle smile, was greeted not as a stranger, but as a beloved part of the community. She marveled at how quickly her life had changed, from the humiliation of being abandoned on a platform to the warmth of belonging, her name spoken with respect and affection. Healing had come not in a single moment, but in countless acts of kindness, in days of shared labor, in nights of whispered vows. Jacob often caught her gaze across these gatherings, his eyes filled with quiet wonder. He could still remember the first moment he saw her, sitting broken on that bench, and he marveled at the grace that had brought her into his life. He carried his grief for Catherine still, but not as a wound, more as a scar that reminded him of love's endurance. With Elizabeth, he felt no betrayal of the past, only fulfillment of a promise, that the heart can heal, that love can rise again, stronger and deeper than before. One golden afternoon, Elizabeth sat beneath the oak tree with her embroidery, the breeze lifting strands of her hair. Jacob approached, his steps slow, his face softened by affection. He knelt beside her, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet reverence of a man who cherished every breath she took. Taking her hand, he kissed her palm, whispering that she had turned his life from ashes into light. Elizabeth's eyes shimmered, her voice breaking with gratitude as she told him he had given her more than love. He had given her healing, a home, a future where once there had been only loneliness. Their kiss beneath the oak was tender, threaded with memory and hope, sealing their devotion once more. As weeks passed, Elizabeth's days grew richer with small joys. She baked loaves of bread whose scent filled the house with warmth. She stitched quilts from scraps of cloth, each patch a memory of days survived and blessings gained. She planted roses along the porch, their blooms like little bursts of fire transformed into beauty. Jacob built her a swing beneath the oak, and in the evenings he would push her gently, her laughter rising into the dusk, his hands steady at her back. In those moments, the world felt whole, healed, and everlasting. Their love was not without its quiet trials, storms that battered the fences, nights when cattle strayed, long hours of work that left them weary, but these challenges only deepened their bond. They faced them together, shoulder to shoulder, never doubting that unity made them stronger. Elizabeth, once cast aside as a burden, now knew herself cherished as the heart of a home. Jacob, once resigned to solitude, now found himself smiling at dawn, eager to rise to a day shared with her. And as another autumn whispered its arrival, painting the fields in strokes of gold and rust, they stood hand in hand on the porch, watching the sun sink low, Elizabeth leaned into Jacob, her heart quiet and full. She whispered that even if tomorrow brought storms, she would never fear, for love had already proven itself mightier than fire. Jacob pressed his lips to her hair, his voice steady as he told her she was his healing, his hope, his forever. The prairie stretched wide before them, endless as the sky above, and beneath its vastness their hearts beat as one. The world had tried to break them, but from the ashes they had risen into love that would endure all things, and as twilight deepened, carrying the soft song of the wind across the fields, they knew their story was not merely of survival, but of grace. Two souls, healed, bound, and destined to walk together into every tomorrow the horizon would unveil. Winter drifted once more across the plains, yet within the walls of sagebrush hills warmth lived unbroken, steady as the flame in the hearth. Snow pressed gently against the windows, muffling the world beyond, but inside, laughter and tenderness filled every corner. Elizabeth moved with grace through the rooms that now truly belonged to her. Curtains she had stitched swayed softly in the kitchen breeze, quilts she had sewn lay folded at the foot of the beds, and her voice, sometimes humming, sometimes singing, rose like a healing balm against the silence that had once haunted the house. Jacob, strong and steadfast, carried wood for the fire, his boots leaving prints across the snowy porch. He would pause sometimes, leaning on the doorframe, watching her as she poured coffee or kneaded bread, and each glance carried the quiet awe of a man who had been given back not only love, but life itself. To him, Elizabeth was more than a wife. She was the healing he had not thought possible, the gentle anchor that steadied him against every storm. The land outside still bore traces of the fire's fury, charred stumps, blackened earth where the grass had been. But even these scars had begun to soften under snow and new growth. Just as the prairie healed, so too had their hearts. What once was loss had become a foundation for renewal, and what once was despair had been transformed into devotion. Together they had discovered that love is not the absence of sorrow, but the strength to build beauty from its ashes. As spring returned, their days overflowed with quiet joys. Elizabeth planted flowers along the fence, roses and daisies that nodded brightly in the breeze. Jacob built a cradle by hand, smoothing the wood until it shone with care, his heart already preparing for the future they dreamed of. The ranch, once nearly lost, now thrived with new life. Calves bawling in the fields, hens clucking as they scratched in the dirt, apple blossoms perfuming the air. Elizabeth often paused in her work to marvel, whispering thanks that from rejection she had found belonging, from loneliness she had found a family, and from sorrow she had found love. Evenings remained their sacred time. They sat side by side beneath the oak tree, its branches heavy with memory and promise. Catherine's grave rested beneath its shade, not a shadow between them, but a silent witness to love's enduring strength. Jacob would speak softly of his past, of the woman he had lost, and Elizabeth would listen with reverence. Then Elizabeth would tell him of her orphaned years, the aching hunger for a home, and Jacob would take her hand, as though vowing she would never feel such loneliness again. Their honesty was their bond, and their bond was their healing. When neighbors visited, laughter carried across the ranch once more. Children played, women shared recipes, men spoke of cattle and storms. Elizabeth was no longer an outsider. She was a cornerstone of the community, her kindness and resilience admired by all. Jacob's friends clapped his back with pride, whispering how blessed he was to have found her. And Jacob, his eyes never leaving her, knew their words were true beyond measure. The years ahead promised more trials, as all lives do, but Elizabeth and Jacob had already proven their strength. They had faced fire, loss, and despair, and had risen hand in hand. Whatever came, storms, hardship, even grief, they would endure, for they had built their love not on fleeting promises, but on truth, sacrifice, and healing that flowed like a river between them. On a golden evening, as the prairie stretched wide and the horizon burned with sunset, Jacob drew Elizabeth close on the porch. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her heart steady. He whispered that she was his forever, and she answered that he was her home. The wind carried their words across the land, as timeless as the sky, as eternal as the stars. And so their story, born from sorrow, found its end not in despair, but in wholeness. A woman once cast aside had become cherished. A man once broken had found healing. And together they had discovered the deepest truth, that love, when tended with kindness and faith, endures every trial and rises brighter than the fire that sought to consume it. Their journey was not merely survival, it was redemption, it was peace, it was love unending. If this story has touched your heart, if it has brought you comfort or a breath of healing light, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice be part of this journey. And if you wish to walk with me further through stories of love, hope, and redemption, please like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for the next chapter. Your presence keeps the flame of these stories alive, and together we can carry their warmth into every heart in need of healing.